Welcome to Detonation Point. I'm your host, Matt O'Neill. I was with the U.S. Secret Service for 25 years and retired as the Deputy Special Agent in charge of the cyber operations part of the Criminal Investigative Division. In Detonation Point, I'm going inside the fight against cybercrime, hearing directly from defenders in government, infrastructure, and enterprise who are racing to stay ahead, because cybercrime isn't slowing down, and neither can we. Welcome to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. Welcome back to Detonation Point. This is a show where we examine cyber risk at the moment it stops being theoretical and starts becoming operational. Today's episode is focused on ransomware and resiliency, not in the headlines, but the mechanics of how ransomware actually succeeds in modern cloud environments and why so many organizations discover their real exposure only after the detonation. Today's guest is Costas Kourmpoglou. Costas is a senior security practitioner and cloud security expert with deep experiences in threat modeling, operational resilience, and securing complex cloud infrastructures. He works with organizations trying to understand not just how ransomware gets in, but how it spreads, persists, and neutralizes recovery. So we're going to talk about ransomware tactics, how they've evolved, how recovery has become a primary target, and what defenders can consistently get wrong when they believe they're already prepared. So Costas, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell the audience what you do for money?
Yeah, of course. So I work for a cybersecurity consultancy in the UK, and we kind of have a bunch of people working on a lot of different complex and systems and services, mostly financial services and the UK government.
And so in doing so, you come across basically all cyber threat kind of groups. If you're going to, say, talk to a mid-sized organization or a financial institution, I guess to start with, what should they be most concerned about? Or does it really depend on what they do and what their crown jewels are?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. It really depends on all of those things. There are cybersecurity groups that specifically avoid targeting certain industries because they would attract the wrong type of attention to them. So we've had a recent kind of case in the UK where a threat group targeted a nursery, and that effectively backfired. With the way that those kind of operations work, they're kind of streamlined businesses, and getting that type of attention across is not something that you really want, right? It's not good for business. And so for a mid-sized business, A, depends what they do for money, or B, effectively, it also depends on what their attack surface effectively, like where they are, what do they do, and how much thought they've put into security in general. Different organizations maybe would have, operational technology in place where they might have a completely different exposure and attract a completely different threat actor group, right? Versus kind of someone who just builds websites for a living.
And so, having been in this game for a long time and seeing the evolution of ransomware, is it fair to say from your perspective that the actors that we were looking at 10, 15, maybe even 20 years ago that were breaking into organizations, stealing payment cards and selling them online, migrated to ransomware? And if so, why do you think that occurred?
I think that occurred because ransomware is a business that pays effectively. And so you kind of tend to, I don't know if there's some economic theory behind it, where the cybercrime tends to kind of optimize the model and kind of attacks that will bring them the most profit effectively and most revenue to their business. And I think this is partially where we've kind of seen that play, and this is how we kind of seen that evolve. Ransomware is a big business that it makes money for a lot of people, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so, as I've said multiple times on this podcast, the answer to all your questions is money. And so this is another example of that. It's more lucrative to engage in ransomware. Is it primarily because, from your perspective, the difficulty in monetizing stolen payment cards and how financial institutions kind of got better at identifying stolen payment cards and shutting them down earlier?
Yeah, fraud has evolved from that perspective. I wouldn't be able to compare and say whether, like a global scale, how kind of that shift has happened between the check fraud, which in Europe has been mostly eliminated because no one is using checks, right? It's all chip and pin. So that hasn't been a thing for probably a couple of decades almost now, versus kind of other countries I'm not going to name, where checks are still, yeah.
Here for whatever. I no idea
Exactly.
why, but yep, it's for the
Where
old
kind
people.
of
Yep.
exactly. So where that kind of is probably still a proliferation, still kind of active thing that you can kind of as a crime kind of person, for lack of a better word,
Yeah.
you kind of can do. I think that the means of entry over the years have changed, where you don't have to be anymore the person that writes the ransomware. You just have to be the person that sends the email, right? You have to be the person that does the social engineering aspect, and someone will effectively give you that ransomware. Now your job is fairly simpler or straightforward or a lot more confined in terms of its complexity, where you have to take care about how does that ransomware land and detonate where you want it to.
So this is a terrible lawyer question because it's a compound question, I think. Obviously, there's been an evolution in ransomware from the early days to now. And you mentioned initial access brokers and kind of like the affiliate model. Can you kind of walk the audience through, like in the early days, how ransomware groups operated, and then to your point, how they've sort of evolved into the multiple businesses that exist today?
Yeah, of course. So in the beginning, you'd have kind of group where they would build the ransomware, that would build effectively the technology that would encrypt your disks, would encrypt your storage, and they would also be the ones that had to take care of making sure that this somehow was in your environment, got into your environment, and started effectively the infection process, the ransomware. They would then need to make sure as well that they had a good payment method and the communication mechanism that would support effectively the victim paying the ransomware. A, because of technical difficulties, right? 10 years ago, you kind of would have sent someone a ransomware note and you say, pay me in some crypto, and they would shrug, right? Like, how do I make a
Yeah.
payment? How does that work? Where do I make an account? And then it kind of follows up into kind of the territory that I think that you are probably a world-renowned expert of, like, how does that effectively then get laundered through, and how does that money move around so that it can eventually end up back to the person who has written the ransomware, right? Now, what has happened is that all of those phases, the writing the ransomware, the deploying the ransomware, the possibly doing a bit of the support and the metrics and the money laundering, is about 4 different groups to 5, like at any given point in time. And they all specialize in a specific aspect, and that has turned effectively the business into a ransomware as a service. I want to say in the last kind of 6 years or so, 7 maybe, where you kind of write the ransomware and then you kind of detach yourself from the business model of how does that work. So you effectively sell the ransomware to people who can then take over the deploy and making sure that it's successful, and then that the ransomware effectively gets where it gets. Everything else around this operation, how you get back the money, the updates as the technology kind of progresses, all of that stuff, you don't have to do any of that. And so all of those kind of 3, 4 actors, I guess, now kind of in coordination in the today's ransomware business.
So it's kind of a brilliant model if you think about it from like a business perspective, because you've taken a lot of the risk off of the hands of the folks that are creating it, and then you're shifting that risk kind of downward. You mentioned payment as well. From your perspective, ransomware took off right around the same time that, as you mentioned, Bitcoin took off. How much do you think that plays into it? So if we lived in a world where cryptocurrency wasn't a thing that's widely available, do you think ransomware would be as effective as it is today?
Possibly not. It really helps with the payment system and the payment processing and the kind of international way of doing business, right? Because you can be a ransomware operator anywhere in the world, can receive payment from anywhere else in the world, right? The attack surface is the whole planet or any business on that planet. Having said that, the eagerness of an organization to, at least in the past, possibly, of paying ransomware to get back on track on the belief that they would be again back to business, would have probably surpassed that barrier of payment, right? But it definitely helps, and it's a kind of a good thing, I guess, that it happened, that it aligned at that time on that whole model.
The other thing is, in the early days, we used to talk about ransomware and say that the actors would charge a percentage enough that it hurt, but not too much that it would be an extinction level event for an organization, but also that it's cheaper than going through a full remediation and recovery process. And that sort of evolved. And I could be way off on this, but it seems the evolution of much higher payments also corresponded with the increase in cyber insurance, because now the payment's actually in many instances not coming from the organization, it's coming from a policy. Am I wrong on that? And is that globally generally how you think that this is sort of one of the reasons why it's also taken off?
Possibly. I don't have the data to kind of back up either view on that, but I think you're kind of onto something from the perspective of, yes, there is a bit more into how the cyber insurance effectively might play out and who's effectively might be sponsoring that ransomware. There is, however, that other shift towards that other level now where cyber insurance policies will straight up say, we're not going to pay ransomware. There are government policies in place that would not kind of outright ban, but really frown upon ransomware payments, because there's another spin on that, right? In that if you pay someone who is part of a sanctioned country or a sanctioned identity, you are then liable for effectively other kind of type of crimes yourself, right? Almost unbeknownst to you from a perspective. So the area there kind of becomes a bit gray on that ransomware payment. But I think you're right that we have seen some fairly outrageous ransomware demands where they've kind of also required the hosting of effectively intermediary services to negotiate for those payments. And I think that for a lot of groups, that has now become the norm, which starts from a price, and then you probably bring in a negotiator through our support chat, and then we'll figure something out between us because we all want the best for your business, right?
Yeah, sure. And what do you think about the collusion between those quote unquote negotiators and the effectors?
Yeah. I think there's been a couple of cases on that which I just stand in awe, at the moral standpoint of some of the people that can pull that, and B, how that becomes a business on its own, but kind of from a back perspective, right? Not from the Nick Voss kind of FBI negotiation and understanding where that can land you, but from the aspect of, okay, I don't know who I'm talking to, but they promised it might help me, so what do I have to lose? And then you might all lose.
Do you still see that the majority of ransomware actors are, or at least what part of the ecosystem is Russian speaking? Or has that changed a lot in the last few years?
That is also kind of a great question. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think that for reasons particular to specific governments, and this one would be from kind of the Russian government, where they have 9 times out of 10 no incentive to hunt and find cybercrime groups that operate within their territory, because the crimes that they're committing are not within their territory, and sometimes they collude internally with kind of higher functions of the internal government. Yes, there is effectively proliferation from that perspective in those areas. Absolutely.
And that's something I think we've seen throughout, and I think Europol even put something out where it said that a lot of the threads that keep specific crime types together is not necessarily the geographic region that they're in, but the language in which they speak, which I always thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you had Jeff White in one of your episodes, and so you'd have cybercrime sponsored in some countries by the government, right? Because it's a legitimate means of bringing in funds to the country from the perspective of certain countries.
Yeah, massive amounts of money can be moving, especially if you're in a depressed part of the world. So you mentioned like the initial access. What are we continuing to get wrong about our security posture for an organizations to remain so vulnerable for that initial access, and kind of walk the listeners through when we're talking about initial access? What does that specifically mean, and how are they getting in?
Yeah, of course. So I guess the idea that you'd have sometimes highly sophisticated kind of 0 days and exploits and vulnerabilities is also and still sometimes plays into account when a threat actor kind of gains access to a network. But a lot of the times, and especially with kind of some high profile kind of recent cases of ransomware attacks, what happens is that there is either a supply chain attack from kind of the internal model of support. So you kind of do business with another kind of company, maybe that company supports you, maybe they're a vendor and for XYZ reason they have access to your systems. They get compromised. They have got standing privileged access to your systems. You effectively kind of get compromised as a result. There's the other side as well. Is what you mentioned, the IBS still a broker systems access where you kind of have credentials that are circulating because people tend to reuse them, because they kind of are well known, because an individual might have sold them to a threat actor for profit. They effectively reuse those credentials to gain access. And that is kind of the simplest way of doing that. Where we kind of tend to get that wrong in general is that we tend to focus a lot on the robustness and the prevention. So Microsoft coined that term, I think, some time ago about kind of assumed breach. We have a successful phishing event, and what we learn from that is that A, we need better training, and B, we need a better filtering mechanism. We don't want to admit that that is going to happen. We probably need to have better detection mechanisms as this happens and then be able to act on it on an almost near real time kind of scenario, right? So the resiliency bit is kind of the bit after that has happened. That we don't want to admit that this is a thing because this is a very difficult thing to kind of admit and think and operate on. And that's where I think we kind of get it wrong most of the time. Not by not assuming that things are going to fail, no matter how many preventive controls you put in place.
And you mentioned training, and I always think every time it's Cybersecurity Month, I think it's October or whenever it is, and I always think, are we doing this again? Are we not familiar with cybersecurity? How much do you think? And I think that there's a whole like business aspect to it as well. But what are we getting wrong? Like we've been talking about training forever, and is it really not training that we need, as you mentioned, whether it's zero trust or whatever? Like, how do we continue to focus on training? And those talk about education, and especially when it comes to like other sort of frauds and stuff. But that's not moving the needle, or is it? And I'm just off on that.
I think there was an interesting research done by Google about a couple of years ago where they were showing that most of their phishing drills, they needed to be fairly tailored and meaningful because otherwise they were completely meaningless on like the effect that they had. So that, I think, combined with the fact that still we kind of have that punishment attitude towards people that fail the training, doesn't combine as a learning capability, right? We need to think of the workflows that we have people go through and how much they need to assess across their, they're just making money. That's what they want to do. And then you kind of have them assess whether that person who just called them is the CEO, that email that they just received is from accounts receivable or whatever. That is a lot of effort to have someone go through. And so training is good, but it needs to be tailored. It needs to be precise. It needs to have a good tone, and it definitely shouldn't be a punishable act if one fails their phishing training campaign.
And it seems like cybersecurity should be part of the business culture. And right, I mean, to your point, if there's a phishing attack or a potential attempted CEO impersonation for BEC, you have to have a culture where you can challenge somebody and not be afraid of getting in trouble. I always go back to when I was with the U.S. Secret Service, and we would go do advances for a protective assignment, and we would be walking around the back end of a hotel for 5 days, and literally nobody ever stopped us. And I remember one time saying, like to one of the workers, how come you didn't ever challenge us? And they said, well, you're in a suit. and you look like you should have been here. And so it's like, well, maybe that's a organizational cultural thing where my former agency trains agents to say respectfully challenge everybody. So if you don't think that they should be there, you should step up and challenge it. And whether that's physical or cyber, it seems like it needs to be part of the culture where you can't be nervous that you're going to get in trouble for trying to do the right thing to protect your organization. Do you think many organizations kind of have that wrong and haven't really prioritized that sort of empowerment to their employees from the day one employee all the way through the C-suite?
Yeah, I think there's a shift in the mentality where cybersecurity has kind of almost or tries to, in general, stop being the police-like figure where you're going to be in trouble if you kind of get caught on that, and more of the we are trying to help and we're there as part of the organization's enablement to do business in a safe and secure way. Now, the problem is definitely cultural because whereas cybersecurity tries to do that sometimes, they also, by extension, sometimes think that the rest of the organization thinks that they assimilate all of the risk. And what I've actually seen in organizations now is kind of what you said, that it's a personal thing. You do something, you are part of the risk. You're owning the risk. Risk is part of everyday business. If you do notice something, here is a telephone number, email, a WhatsApp group, or whatever that you can talk to someone and raise that concern. So they are really trying to shift that dialogue, shift that culture into cybersecurity is kind of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man who can help if things go wrong, if you kind of notice something. How successful that is still debated, I guess, because ultimately, sometimes people do not want to be involved in those further discussions, right? That takes time out of their day. They're going to report that someone's going to call them. They're going to ask them more questions. What is the benefit? What is the reward on that? So it really needs to be part of the culture. There needs to be sometimes incentives in doing kind of those things, right? And it takes time to have that shift, but that shift is happening.
Have you seen any issues in your engagements with where the cultural problem isn't necessarily with the rank and file, but it's at the C-suite level where they have a sense of entitlement? So maybe in some instances the rules don't necessarily apply because I'm a busy person and I'm traveling. Hey, can you do me a favor and basically get rid of XYZ controls? Is that something that is more common than not?
It really depends on the industry. There are definitely people who do not want to have anything to do with that. Depending on the industry and the size of the organization, a lot of the people on kind of the almost board level, they don't really work on computers on a day-to-day basis, right? They have someone else who works on their computer on their behalf. They at most carry an iPad and a phone, and they'll have access to their emails pretty much and a calendar. Everything else is done by someone else. Now, those people, like the executive assistants, the kind of the support staff, the close teams effectively who would be doing the work, they wouldn't be able to kind of get away from that, right? Because ultimately, if something happens, they would be liable now on the behalf of the person that they're representing. So it's fairly unlikely, especially in large organizations and in regulated industries. But as you kind of move into different industries and you move to kind of some of the VIPs, that is 100% something that still takes place today.
Yeah. And so going back to sort of like the initial access, what are the vectors that you're seeing most often now, and how many of them are bypassing traditional security controls? So give the listeners a feel of like what can they be doing right now, and what they should be on the lookout for that initial access, and then we'll go into sort of like the maintaining quiet persistence and all that stuff.
Yeah. So I think what has been kind of proliferating is the reuse of credentials. This has always kind of been one of the most common ways that accounts are effectively compromised across. You kind of have one password in your email and you tend to use that password for your food delivery service, and then your food delivery service leaks that or gets hacked or whatever, and then all of a sudden, maybe it's a month down the line, maybe it's 3 years down the line, your email is also compromised. So that account reuse is one of the worst things that currently happens, is one of the most common ways that accounts get compromised. And of course, we've been talking about this for a decade now, if not more, about kind of MFA, which is something that everyone must have, especially on their personal accounts.
So it's also interesting because that's some of the tactics that the good guys use to pivot off of compromised credentials, where it's the same username password will help you find additional accounts. So if I have the same unique password and I got hit with breach data 3 different places, I can pivot. And we've actually made several cases off of that to get to that attribution on who the bad actors are. So once they gain access into a network, are you seeing a length of time before they actually do something material? And what is the trend?
Yeah, so you wouldn't kind of want to act immediately unless you kind of get access to somewhere that is a bit meatier. You'd probably stay at one point and try to figure out the lay of the land, leave off the land, so you kind of reuse the tools that are available to you without kind of raising any kind of suspicions and alarms. Once you kind of have a good grasp of where you are, what you can get access to as time progresses, sorry, the risk of getting caught also increases. So you kind of want to, on one side, on one hand, act fast, but on the other hand, you do want to get into the crown jewels. So there's a bit of a compromise of where you kind of go with that, but definitely there's not an immediate action that takes place. Once you've found something, kind of grasp on it, and it kind of evolves from there. But it can take months. So I think in the last big example that I call, from initial compromise, it was probably around 2 to 3 months until the actual ransomware event took place.
And so you mentioned sort of the lateral movement that they do, then, in some instances, the escalation of privileges till they get to where they're at. Do the bad actors take into account the organization's sort of like backup strategy? So if I update every 30 days, I'm going to stay in long enough to basically get through that cycle. So then therefore I can make sure that you cannot basically reconstitute your data through your backups. Is that something that they're actively monitoring?
Can't recall that I've kind of seen on anything that is that sophisticated, but it's a lot more brute force. If you stumble across the backup, just delete it, right? There's no elegance to figuring out cycles, schedules, and whatever.
Yeah.
Just wipe it or ransomware it. Same thing, right? It's a win-win. So that's, I think, definitely a thing. Absolutely. Because storage is storage. You don't care.
Right. And so are you seeing a change in the evolution in what they're doing with the data from just encrypting it to now either exfiltrating it and then holding it basically for hostage, and then sort of like the double extortion kind of techniques? Is that pretty common now?
Yeah, I think that in theory, at least, right, it's beneficial to kind of a threat actor to be able to pull the dual extortion, because they then could resell the data that they have exfiltrated. If that doesn't happen, the fallback is ransomware. It's also, however, a bit of a different market in a sense where you'd kind of have to sell that data. But yeah, ultimately, they want to always aim for that dual extortion bit. Depending on the group, sometimes it can be just more of a shotgun approach where they don't have time to exfiltrate the data. They'll use that, they'll try to automate as much as they can as part of their deployment. They'll encrypt a bunch of stuff, happy days. The data exfiltration might require a bit more thought. The automation might kind of not be there, or if it fails, it doesn't matter as long as the ransomware runs. All we care about is that we hit 50 different targets, right? That's kind of how we operate. So it kind of depends with the threat group sometimes.
Are you seeing some threat groups that are just doing the straight exfil and then the extortion instead of even just deploying ransomware?
Yeah. Good question. I cannot recall any kind of specific example of that. Yeah. Sorry.
No. What are your thoughts on organizations that do pay to prevent, theoretically, the bad actors from releasing the data? Do you think that is a wise business decision, or kind of ridiculous considering they're dealing with cyber criminals that are not trustworthy?
I think that organizations probably don't know the real metrics. The UK government's kind of National Cybersecurity Centre, I think, released some statistics where they found that about 70% of the time, 60% of the time, something like that, if I recall correctly, only is when you kind of get back your data. And so worse than 50-50 is what the stat that I remember in my mind. I don't think that you'd need to be at a level of desperation that you'd have to do that. And obviously you kind of face a business extinction type of event like that, you would be at the level of desperation. It's just that unfortunately you lose more money and also not recover your business by most accounts, right? And as I said earlier, you might be liable, depending on who you're paying, for charges on kind of your business and on your behalf, because you might be paying threat groups that are sanctioned. So I kind of get it, but it's something that I think everyone kind of in the business frowns upon and really, really tries to disincentivize business from doing so. And instead, paying the money to kind of build a bit more resilience and treat that as a, if you were to pay that as ransomware and have a 50-50 chance, might as well pay it for resilience and have a better outcome out of that.
Well, that's a really good transition to, are we trying to treat a problem, a symptom, and not the larger sort of disease? And so talk a little bit from your perspective on, if you focus more on business continuity and resiliency, the ransomware takes care of itself, meaning you'll be much more protected. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think in a sense, yeah. Kind of going back to something that you mentioned about culture and the business continuity plans and how we treat ransomware, is that it sits kind of solely most of the time within cybersecurity. But if you cannot run a business, that is not just cybersecurity's problem, right? This is a business problem. It just happens to sit within the remit of control and mitigation that cybersecurity could partially look after. So this is where I see kind of the biggest problem today in organizations, that they kind of play the whose problem is it anyway?
Yeah. We used to call it the Super Bowl of finger pointing, or the
Yes.
World Cup of finger pointing for our international friends. Like, that is
Okay.
100%. And then also, have you seen scenarios where an attack happens and the organization doesn't report it until such a time that it's really impossible for anybody to really help them out?
I think that this was so common that regulations came through from kind of multiple aspects of that, both from the insider trading conversations that have happened in the past with some of the fairly prolific and prominent kind of breaches in the past, to the care of duty effectively the organizations we have, because the information that was breached and was leaked was millions of individuals, and they need to report that back. So yeah, today we kind of have in the EU, there's the DORA Act, GDPR, where it's applicable if it involves the breach of kind of people's Information Commission's Office in the UK and members EU states. They have their own, where you need to, as an organization, report the breach and say, this is what has happened, this is how many records we've expected we've lost, and this is what we're effectively going to do about it. So you cannot get away without reporting, because the repercussions from a law perspective now are there and are in place.
Do you think that we are collectively suffering from sort of like a breach fatigue? Because it seems like every day something has happened, so we're just becoming desensitized to it.
I mean, yes, I think that this is unfortunately something that is so common, where people as consumers, we kind of see the news and we kind of say, yeah, that I had an account there, I had all of my medical history there, that's gone. Maybe because we don't necessarily, for some people, we don't see the immediate effects that this has. Maybe that's kind of part of the reason. Maybe because there are so many places these days that we've just sent data, right? And we're going to populate our names and our addresses and our credit card numbers and whatever kind of everywhere. But yes, that is something that is 100% kind of real, to the point that it has almost a feedback loop effect, where it decreases the level of attention that organizations would take, because then you don't need to actually do anything security wise. You just need to manage the comms a bit better and kind of deal with that, right?
Yeah.
because it's just another bridge, guys. Nothing to look at here.
So, from your perspective, if you were talking to an organization, what would be the, say, top 3 or 4 things that every organization absolutely has to do to minimize the business impact of a ransomware or another cybersecurity attack, and to make sure that they have a business continuity plan so that they can continue to operate in a manner that many other organizations fail to do?
So depending on the industry and where they operate, the best kind of example that a regulator has kind of bring in terms of operational resilience would be from the UK's PRA, where they have effectively put out the guidance and the law on what certain firms have to do. And the first thing is, I'm going to use the parlance that the PRA is using, is figure out your important business systems. What is effectively that makes your business go about? Where's the engine of that business? What are those customer facing critical systems? You might not be surprised to hear that a lot of organizations don't do that, name them, or they'll name things that really don't matter, right? And they'll just increase their scope and the effort and the load without kind of any particularly good reason. So know the stuff that is really important, and B, again, as part of that nice regulation, is that figure out your impact tolerances. But then the tricky bit here is that you need to communicate those impact tolerances with almost everyone in the business. So what that impact tolerances mean, right, is that you kind of want to make a mortgage application, or you kind of want to make a payment, right? What is the expected time of this effectively wouldn't be able to operate as a system function until you kind of restore that function? Can you maybe restore it partially? Can you kind of run a minimum viable business, as it's called? How can you kind of do that? And a lot of the time, the business will kind of come along and say, yeah, it's half a day. And then no one from an ICT perspective or cybersecurity or the people who will operate that will agree to that number, because it's maybe the first time that they've heard this number. Half a day. How could we do that in half a day? We have like a petabyte to restore. With the current rate, it will take a week to actually do that. And so that's kind of one of those things that is very obvious, but people having the same expectations and being on the same kind of table around that is one of the most critical things that an organization can do today. So figure out your stuff, figure out how long it's going to fail, figure out who's going to be responsible, and who do you want to bring in on that conversation when it fails.
So, a lot of it sounds like lack of planning. So, right, or they'll do tabletop exercises, but they won't actually do the thing to ensure that they can have a recovery.
Yeah, it's parts of the resilience kind of nomenclature. This is called resiliency as found and resiliency as imagined, right? And this is as it sounds pretty much. Someone has thought that, yeah, this is how the system is going to operate. This is how the process takes place. This is what we're going to do about it. And I think the terminology comes from medical kind of sector, and especially from clinicians who then had to deal with that process. And on the ground, hands-on, they had, the process was nothing like that was imagined. Like the process as operated would not cope with kind of the reality pretty much. And so, yes, that is absolutely one of those things. And we can call it lack of planning, but ultimately we need to run the scenarios, which is actually almost ironically enough from our conversation, the next bit of the regulation, which is figuring out and writing down plausible scenarios that are impactful to your business. One of those, which could be ransomware. But the idea here that I'm saying the regulator and most kind of organizations like mine want to instill is that tabletop exercise is an amazing starting point, but it's not the end of it. You can't just say that I've done a tabletop exercise, now we all know how to respond to ransomware event. Like, no, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. You need to keep doing those. You need to actually run events. You need to take out systems. You need to run chaos engineering. You need to enact effectively on all of those things and figure out really who is responsible of that, and then take it to the next level of making that happen to your business and figuring out how you're really going to respond on that. This is how you know that, you're resilient, because most people have a lot of assumptions about how their systems operate or how their business operate. And they put this on a plan. The plan never survives contact with the enemy, right?
Yeah. Do you, yeah, no doubt about it. And do you think that some of the challenges are people map their spend, they map their sort of their plans to certain cybersecurity frameworks that aren't as fast to evolve as the bad actors are to evolve. So for example, if you're mapping your spend and what you're doing to say backups and say, okay, well, what does the framework say? Do you have offline backups? Yes. Do you update them monthly? Yes. Check. We're moving on. And maybe that's not, do you have immutable backups, not only for ransomware, but for business continuity? Like drilling down on how the bad actors are taking advantage of those gaps in the cybersecurity frameworks, recognizing that it's hard for a CISO probably to try to get additional funding for things outside of those current frameworks. Is that something that you see at a global level?
Yeah, yes, because it kind of goes back to the culture of the organization. A lot of people in resiliency, they talk about that from the systems kind of thinking point of view as well. They talk about socio-technical systems. And so where we kind of go and say, okay, we have a scenario, that scenario involves ransomware. Ransomware sounds like threats, bad actors, it's cybersecurity, we'll put it on their budget. But ultimately, your business needs to be able to respond to that. The fact that cybersecurity probably has within your organization the subject matter opinion that matters doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be the only ones that need to invest in solving this problem, right? And so the disconnect here is that you kind of play the, as you said earlier, like the whose problem is it anyway game. And when you try to attribute that, you kind of go back to the single source. Yeah, it's the cybersecurity people. They need to take care of it from their budget. They have a limited budget. It's okay. We've attributed that. What can we do?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it sounds like, if I have this right, if you don't know whether you can recover cleanly, you don't have resilience. You just basically have hope.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are a lot of BCPs that are kind of full of hopes and dreams of people,
Yeah.
right? Of as imagined systems that the system should do that, it should do that. There's another aspect which I'm very interested about from safety management that you kind of reminded me now. And so in safety management, they kind of have there's a famous paper about safety one and safety two. And we tended to focus about how things tend to go wrong versus why do things go right? Like
Okay.
why do they actually work, right?
Right.
And this kind of change in that perspective is the if you base your assumptions of, the ransomware is going to happen or whatever event is going to happen, then okay, that's fine because we have isolated backups. Somehow we don't kind of know. We know that we might have that network connectivity though, because how else are we going to back up, right? But they get isolated, and then when the event happens, that lateral movement cannot take place. We can't get that infected or whatever, and then we're going to be able to restore like that because everything else is going to also magically appear, right? That is a lot of assumptions that we've made in series. If you want to think about bad stuff happening, imagine that you don't have access to your phone. You don't
Hmm.
know how to communicate to someone, let alone kind of like restoring to a server that already holds the configuration of your organization. You don't know who you can call because you don't have a phone effectively that you can call.
Yeah.
That is the level of plausible scenario that you sometimes kind of have to go, and the level of assumption from the other side that you kind of need to operate.
Oh, that's interesting. If you had to think about a conversation you and I are having 3 and 5 years from now, how do you project the landscape to change?
I don't think that much is going to change except from how easier it will be still to gain that initial access both to the ransomware tooling and to be part of that kind of cybercrime ecosystem, but also to kind of the initial credentials that I think that are going to proliferate more and more I'm going to just bring this as an example of just services that exist. There are a lot of Gen AI services out there. People will probably use and log in and register to a dozen of them, right? There's going to be other services on top of that. So technology increases, we just get to log in and put our personal details into a lot more stuff. So I think that won't change in the next 3 to 5 years at all.
Is there anything you're optimistic about?
Oh, is that? Yeah. Optimism, mate. I think I might be in the wrong business for optimism.
Yeah, I think.
But I'm definitely optimistic from the perspective of cultural change effectively that is happening. Most cybersecurity functions now must play the role of an enabler. Otherwise, they don't serve any good purpose of effectively existing, because risk reduction is fairly fluffy in most cases.
Mhm.
Risk reduction, whilst also preventing business from taking place, that is a harder conversation to have. Although that's a bigger challenge for cybersecurity, to be able to almost simultaneously try to manage that risk a bit better whilst enabling the business to work. This is the cultural shift that is happening, where they're not the people in the ivory towers or just plain no, or, just not being in the same room with the rest of the business. That has slowly kind of made its way through, and hopefully will in the next kind of 5 years.
Yeah, great. Well, Costas, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the conversation. Learned a ton, and I know our listeners did as well. So really appreciate you joining us here on Detonation Point, presented by Elastio.
Thank you very much for having me, Matt.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. And for those listening, ask yourself just one question. If ransomware detonated tonight, do you know which path you will use to recover and which ones will actually make things worse? And thank you so much. And we will see you next time on Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. Thank you.